Good morning and welcome everyone to the 11th meeting of the Local Government and Communities Committee. Can I please ensure that all mobile phones are in silent, and just a reminder that broadcasting will operate your camera and microphone as usual. Please allow a short pause before being called on to speak to allow them to do so. Before I go into agenda item 1, can I just apologise? For the delays this morning, technical issues. At agenda item 1, we have consideration of whether to take agenda items 4 and 5 in private. Item 4 is consideration of the evidence heard today on no recourse to public funds. Item 5 is consideration of an analysis of responses to licensing of static mobile phones with permanent residents. As we are meeting remotely, rather than asking whether everyone agrees, I will instead ask if anyone objects. If there is silence, I will assume your content. Does anyone object? Thank you very much. That is agreed. Items 4 and 5 will be taken in private. Agenda item 2, the committee will take evidence on the issue of no recourse to public funds. The committee's attention was drawn to the vulnerability of asylum seekers and those with insecure immigration status following the tragic events of last summer. In particular, the committee was concerned at the plight of people with no recourse to public funds and the gaps that those seeking to help them in local authorities and the third sector have found in the system. We sought some written evidence on the issue and agreed to hold a one-off evidence session to explore some of the issues raised in more detail in a public forum. Today, we hear from a range of organisations regarding the provision of support to people who have no recourse to public funds. And I welcome our first panel today, Suzanne Miller, Interim Chief Officer of Glasgow City Council and the Glasgow City Health and Social Care Partnership, Elise Nutbrown, Policy Manager, Migration, Population and Diversity, COSLA, and Gurjambo Polobutu, Manager of Shakti Women's Age. Thank you all for being here today and for your written submissions. We've allocated about an hour for this session and we have a number of issues to discuss with you. But before we go on to that, just some brief technical information. There's a pre-arranged questioning order and I will call each member in turn to ask their questions for a block of up to 9 minutes. It would help broadcasting if members could indicate who in the panel the questions are addressed to. We may have a short amount of time for supplementary questions at the end. As there are 3 people on the panel, please indicate clearly if you wish to answer the question, for instance by raising your hand, and don't feel the need to answer every question fully. For example, if you agree with the point just made, you should feel free simply to confirm this. Could I ask everyone to give broadcasting staff a second to operate your microphones before you speak. We'll now move on to questions, and the first question will come from Alexander Stewart.
Good morning, thank you, Convener. Can I ask the panel if they could provide us with some information generally about how they individually support people who have no resources to public funds? Who wants to go first?
Suzanne.
Thank you, Convener. Hopefully you can hear me.
Yeah.
So in terms of the perspective that I come from as the Chief Officer of the Health and Social Care Partnership, but also having worked in Glasgow City Council for 30 years and the last since 2006 with responsibility for asylum, how our organisation, previously the Council, now the Health and Social Care Partnership, supports people with no recourse to public funds is articulated in the policy and procedure document that we submitted as part of our evidence. It's very much been an evolving picture for us in terms of being confident and reassured about the legal framework within which we can operate as local authority to support people with no recourse to public funds. Part of our business in relation to that support are very clear, particularly around about, for example, with dependent children, and that's articulated in the policy document that we submitted. There are other areas where there is a need for a very clear social work assessment in relation to need, and there's clear criteria set out in the policy document about need that goes beyond destitution. And if we can, through assessment, establish needs beyond destitution for adults, for example, then we are able to offer support to people with no recourse to public funds. That's not as straightforward necessarily as the document itself would suggest, and it's an area of policy and practice for us within the local authority on which we've relied particularly heavily on support from COSLA and Strategic Migration Partnership and from the third sector, in trying as a local authority to be as compassionate as possible in the implementation of that policy, while recognising that we do have legal restrictions, that immigration is not a devolved responsibility, and we have to be really clear about how we manage to continue to operate within that legal framework while taking a compassionate approach to support people with no recourse to public funds, where I think our relationship with the third sector has got much stronger, and I think for myself, and certainly working with Eloise and the team at the Strategic Migration Partnership, my view is that that partnership has yielded, I think, a much more effective support system for people with no recourse to public funds. And for me, that partnership between local authorities and the third sector is where we continue to have some mileage or some room, if you like, to offer support to people with no recourse to public funds. The last year has brought a different set of challenges on all of the business that I'm responsible for, and one of the advantages of the last year has been that because of COVID-19 and some of the public health restrictions attached to that, we have been in a position to offer a number of people with no recourse to public funds quite clear support from the local authority working alongside Scottish Government. So this year's been a different year for us. But the short answer to your question is it's a difficult area of policy and practice for local authorities, which we continue to work our way through.
Thank you.
Eloise?
Good morning. So Suzanne says, I'm based within the Strategic Migration Partnership within COSLA, and our team kind of broadly supports local authorities in relation to migration, humanitarian protection, and part of my role is working to support councils to respond to no recourse to public funds restrictions. So there's two ways that we seek to assist local authorities and the community partners. One is monitoring the policy impacts. So it's a complex policy area. It changes frequently, and the impact of the policy on migrants with different immigration statuses is quite challenging. So we provide national guidance in partnership with Just Right Scotland and the No Recourse to Public Funds Network, which is available. And that sets out the legal framework that local authorities are operating within. And we seek to support local authorities to think about the service provision that can be put in place under statutory duties, how to provide that effectively. And we've looked recently at training and awareness raising to support frontline workers to respond. At a policy level as well, we support our elected members within COSLA, so that COSLA's leadership and our Community Wellbeing Board in particular have taken an interest in the issues and have been looking at what the opportunities for working with the Scottish Government and the UK Government are to try to prevent destitution. So we have long-standing policy positions in relation to the removal of NRPF conditions. We've got calls that are cross-party political calls that we advocate for, and we seek to engage the UK Government. We've also been working with the Scottish Government on the development of an anti-destitution strategy, a strategy that will look at how we can work with the third sector and maximise statutory powers to be able to prevent and mitigate homelessness, rough sleeping, food insecurity and the other issues that we've seen the third sector in particular really draw attention to over the last few years. And as Suzanne mentioned, during the last 12 months, given the public health crisis, increasingly our team has also shifted focus to looking at what the public health response meant for people with no recourse. And we convened an additional network. So we run a typical network with our local authorities and officers come together to share practice. But we convened a consortium with the third sector to monitor needs and to pick up on kind of changes in the experiences of migrants and to escalate those both within local government and to the Scottish Government. I think the main areas that we're looking at the moment are the EU settlement scheme and the changing rights and entitlements of EA nationals. And we can hopefully come to that throughout the course of the morning, but there will be some significant impacts of the changes in rights and entitlements to EA nationals. We're anticipating an increased number of people with no recourse to public funds and significantly increased risks of destitution. And we're looking at how to respond, how local authorities need to prepare to respond, but also what we need from partnership working.
Thank you.
Okay. And Gajramba?
Hi, you can call me Giri for short. I think Girijamba is becoming a bit difficult. That's okay. As a service provider, I'm coming from how we operate. Shakti has been supporting women with no recourse to public funds since it has been established. And I can comfortably say that we are one of the main third sector who raised the concerns about supporting women with no recourse to public funds. And we work closely with Scottish Government, we work closely with COSLA and any other organization who are working towards bringing a change to to support women with no recourse to public funds. We also sit on the National No Recourse to Public Funds campaign body and have been instrumental in bringing in the DDVC concession. So when we receive a referral, we support women, we provide information, emotional support to the women, we do risk assessment of the case, and then where necessary, we refer the women to other agencies for support. We also refer the women to MARAC. We help her to get accommodation. We help her to get help from the immigration solicitors. But these are all things that we do, but saying that there are a lot of barriers because she has no recourse to public funds. We raise some funds to support women initially for day-to-day life, but that's not much. We raise very little money. Where we do not get any funds from anywhere else, we then give the women £30 to start off per week, and that's not for a long time. We also have access to money from Southall Black Sisters, which is the main campaign body who campaign for women with no recourse to public funds. They have some funds to support women with no recourse to public funds. And initially it was only for the UK. Later on, because of our negotiations, they started funding Scottish organizations as well. But that again, they only fund accommodation, not subsistence funds. What else? We work closely with the police. We work closely. It's very difficult for us as a third sector and the BME women's organization. It's very difficult to access services for women with no recourse to public funds. Not all organizations are open to support the women with no recourse to public funds. Even during the COVID, one thing that was positive was, accommodation was open to anybody who is homeless. That was good. But despite, of having that convenience, our women still faced barriers at the beginning when they approached housing, when they approached other refugees. They weren't initially given accommodation. It wasn't that simple at the beginning. Later on, yes, it got better. But then there were women who were put in mixed gender accommodation. That became a little bit difficult as well. And another thing was that some of the accommodation providers, especially refugees, they were concerned what will happen after the COVID. Okay, whatever was provided, that was only during the COVID period. But what happens after post-COVID? Where will the women go? So that was also another barrier for many organizations to offer accommodation to the women.
Thank you.
Okay.
And just as a final one, brief one to Suzanne. So you've given us a very good flavour of what has actually happened and policies you have to manage, Suzanne. But what practical terms has the pandemic had on, and what lasting processes will you look at, and how lessons will be learned from all of this going forward? Quickly, Suzanne, thank you.
The opportunity that's afforded us beyond the people who are quite clearly come within the power of welfare that local authorities have, and we've enacted that. The people who we've been able to accommodate, particular piece of practical work that's come out of that is working alongside the third sector to the HSCP in Glasgow, this is just Glasgow City, have extended funding for 3 months beyond whenever we've made a commitment to extend beyond 3 months whenever the central funding is withdrawn. And that's specifically to allow us to work with the third sector organisations, primarily but not exclusively through the Refugee Council and the legal organisations, to make sure that everybody has exhausted any kind of rights of appeal. So to work with individuals, we've identified a team leader within our homelessness services to undertake that work. So that at the end, it was to give ourselves in the third sector 3 months to make sure that we have exhausted every single possible support that could be offered legally from the local authority, but also any other representation that could be made with legal support and with SRC support. We've also, Eloise mentioned the EU nationals, we've also specifically have a piece of practical work going on about encouraging any EU nationals who have not already applied for settled status, who are currently within that emergency type situation just now, and we're working again in the accommodation, mainly through third sector, because their experiences, particularly with EU nationals, they're more likely to have to be able to engage with them because we are seen as an authority and part of the wider authority. So practical steps like that we're taking at this point in time to make sure that if there's anybody in that cohort that can access public funds and or a fresh claim, we'll support that.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for that, Alexander. As we move out of the pandemic, obviously there must be things that have been learned through working together in a way that that hasn't really happened before at such a level. What key messages do you have for the next local government, local government committee, the Scottish Government, and I suppose even a message that you'd wish to send down to Westminster about how best that you could support people with no recourse to public funds? And Eloise, you're up my screen, so you can tick it off. Could we unmute Eloise, please?
Hi, can you hear me? Thank you.
Yes.
I think the key message that we have within local government for the UK government is around the policy itself. I mean, fundamentally, we've been calling for a long time for the no recourse to public funds conditions to be removed and lifted, and for alternative ways of managing immigration to be introduced. But we understand the intent behind the policy is to make sure that people are contributing financially within the UK when they live here. But the reality is that when people hit times of crisis, when they lose work, and as we see the economy really struggling coming out of the pandemic, social security is a human right that local government supports the access to for everybody, regardless of immigration status. And we've been advocating for the conditions to be lifted so that mainstream centrally government funded support can be in place, opposed to a local government safety net, which is expensive to resource and administer, and isn't meeting the needs of everyone who requires it. In Scotland, and for the local government committee, we're really clear that there are powers and duties, as Suzanne has outlined, that local authorities have. They are increasingly challenging to resource and deliver and administer, both in terms of the numbers of people that are requiring assistance, but also the financial implications are really, really significant. I mean, we're talking financial payments for families to meet housing costs and daily subsistence needs for years at a time in some cases, and particularly Edinburgh City Council and Glasgow City Council consistently have high costs and a consistent population who require that ongoing support. So the main call that we've had for the Scottish Government, which they've responded to, and we are bringing forward a strategy, is to work together to look at the scope of the powers and the duties that local authorities have, how we define vulnerability in order to be able to apply those duties, and how we fund them, and kind of the best ways actually going forward of providing a social security system effectively under those kind of devolved pieces of legislation. So we'd like to see that work taken forward at pace in the form of a review, but with clear outcomes that we can discuss and start to implement. And the other changes in terms of learning from the pandemic is, as Suzanne said, there's been some brilliant examples of, we can't praise the third sector partners enough in terms of their willingness to work with local authorities and to actively to respond to need. They also need to be supported, and they need to be able to access ongoing funding, and they need to be able to work effectively with local authorities. For that to happen, the national strategy needs to provide that framework and crucially the sustainability of funding for those partners to keep providing accommodation, food, legal advice. These are all really essential needs that we need to make sure are kind of in place within our communities. So we're keen to discuss both the funding implications for local government and for the third sector. And the final area that we really need to focus on, we talk about innovation. I think it's fairly basic stuff though in many ways. We're talking about a safe place for people to stay, some cash support and food, and access to legal advice so that people can fundamentally re-enter the normal systems and the mainstream services. So it's more about partnership working than innovation in many ways.
Okay, that's good. That takes me on to you, Judy. I mean, one of the things that was clear during the ongoing pandemic was the partnership working that grew between local authorities, third sector organisations. What do you think that we could take then from that and take on once this pandemic's over, and make sure that we don't go back to the old ways of silos? Judy. Judy?
Oh, me? Oh, sorry. Sorry. I agree with what all Louise said, that, we would like to see the no recourse to public funds policy abolished if possible, and funds available to women and children who have no recourse to public funds, irrespective of their immigration status. And moving for everything that Louise said, copy-paste. But moving forward, we would like for local authority to continue to provide the accommodation for women with no recourse to public funds. And maybe there is some kind of subsistence money available to these women. Currently, the way we support women is through Section 12 and 22 Children's Act, Scotland Act 1995. But there is no consistency. Edinburgh is very good. It has a protocol, very good protocol. And because we are, our office is in Edinburgh, the women in Edinburgh get fairly good service, women with no recourse to public funds. But it's not the same in like Dundee, where we have an outreach service, Port Valley, where we have an outreach service, and in Fife. So we want to see consistency across Scotland in getting funds for the no recourse to public funds women.
So I take it that would be sort of part of that whole destitution work that you're doing with the government then?
Yes, and the thing is, the domestic destitution violence concession, DDVC, that only applies to spouse visas, women who are here on spouse visas. It doesn't apply to any other insecure immigration status. Say during COVID period, we really had increased referrals as well, and there were women with no recourse to public funds. There were young women studying in universities who had no recourse to public funds. They were really stuck during that period because no funds, they can't go back home. Yeah. And there were quite a few post-marriage referrals as well.
Right. Okay. Okay. Suzanne, the extra 3 months that you were talking about is an excellent piece of work. It's fabulous to hear about other local authorities take that up as well. But what lessons do you think that the local authority have learned through this period in terms of particularly people with no recourse to public funds about how important it is to work with the third sector?
I think that was a really important point about the lack of consistency, and I think from a local authority perspective I would recognise that, and I know Eloise, in terms of the work, she was very polite about training of frontline staff being a key task for COSLA, because part of that relates to that lack of consistency, to be fair to local authorities. I think that directly relates to their experience. So you would find the Edinburgh protocol that's just been referenced is the same as the Glasgow protocol. It's built on the work we did in Glasgow. We have worked closely with Edinburgh in terms of that policy procedure, and worked closely then with COSLA to influence and support the destitution strategy, the anti-destitution strategy. But you do find inconsistencies because there's a whole range of frontline staff for whom it's not part of their daily experience, and it's really, really complicated legislative framework within which to work. I think what I would take out of our experience in Glasgow through COVID with no recourse to public funds, it was a pretty straightforward experience in that there had always been a commitment to third sector, to working in partnership with the third sector. So COVID accelerated that, but I think partly the success of it was because it took out the point of tension between local authorities and third sector about whether or not somebody met the criteria for the local authority to fund, if I'm being entirely honest. And I think what was left then was Eloise has referenced it as well. We've always had a decent working relationship with the third sector, but there is conflict at the point where, because there are different views about eligibility in relation to what power of welfare the local authority can enact. And as a local authority, you have to act on the legal advice that you get as a public servant. That had been a point of tension. So my reflection in terms of what COVID allowed us to do is it took that massive point of tension out of the relationship with the third sector and allowed us to focus on people and allowed us to focus on our different strengths and skills and what we could do together. So that's why we're hugely supportive, obviously, of the position that COSLA have taken in terms of the ask of the Westminster government, because I think we've demonstrated that when you take that point of tension out, actually what local authorities can do working alongside the third sector is hugely significant in terms of improving outcomes for some of the most vulnerable people that we'll ever see.
Yeah. Okay, thank you very much for that. Sarah, do you want to come in now? Oh, sorry, Eloise. Sarah, maybe let you in on this one and you can relate to it. Sarah?
Okay. Thanks very much, convener. I found the evidence in front of us incredibly moving, but also very useful in terms of suggestions as to how we might see change. Can I pick my first question to Jiri? I know that you've said that Shakti's particularly got a good relationship with the council in Edinburgh, but one of the things that struck me was you said that Edinburgh Local Authority has got a protocol that actually enables it to support women to work with no recourse to public funds. Can you say a little bit about that protocol in practical terms and how it works? And then I thought if I maybe brought in Eloise afterwards to talk about how we might get it spread across other local authorities in Scotland as well. So first of all, Jiri from Shakti.
Hi. When we have a woman who doesn't fit into the DDVC concession criteria, we refer the women to the asylum and refugee unit in the council. I think it's to do with the social work thing. So under the section 12 and 22, they fund that women for accommodation and subsistence expenses as well. So it works very well. And all that the criteria to refer us to council is that the woman, prior to the referral, she needs to take advice for immigration So we help the women to get in touch with the immigration solicitor, and then the referral is made. And from there on, it's the asylum and refugee unit and the council that supports. It's mainly social work that support the women. And recently it has been very good that what has been good is before that, women who don't have children, they still fell through the gaps. So there was no support for them unless they were vulnerable, certified as vulnerable adults. But we have seen those women are also getting help nowadays, so which is really good for us. So, and we do the practical support, and social work funds financially, and we help the women to get advice from the immigration solicitor. And in most cases, it takes maybe a year or two by the time the woman gets indefinite leave to remain, depending on her immigration and also risks to her in her country and things like that. Yes.
That's very useful.
That's not the same. Like I said, we have outreach service in Fife, Dundee, and Fort Valley. It's not the same. Even during COVID period, we found it difficult to get support for women in these areas financially. So, yeah.
Thanks, that's very useful, Jerry. Eloise, can I follow up that question? Because if I speak to my local councillors, they always tell me they don't have enough money for almost anything. And I don't agree with small pots of money, but in this case, targeted money across our councils where they need it potentially would be useful. But what about that comment from Jerry about the protocol that Edinburgh has? Is there a way that the could be shared with other councils and give them the support? Because obviously gearing up social work staff on the front line to have that knowledge is not something you can just flick a switch and it happens. Is there a resource issue here? Is it a cultural issue or a political priority? What more needs to be done to take that approach and make it work elsewhere?
So I think there's a few challenges and opportunities as well. So there are a number of authorities that have protocols in place, and Suzanne might correct me if I'm wrong, but the feedback from local authorities is you can't have a single protocol for every council because the arrangements of health and social care partnerships, where social work sit and how they interact with other services, it's so different. So a shared protocol isn't usually desirable, but what we do through our NRPF network is routinely bring local authorities together to share their practice and to discuss how things are done. And as Suzanne mentioned, having worked with Edinburgh Council, I know through speaking to Edinburgh Council colleagues that they've had discussions with a number of other councils in recent months and over the last couple of years, sharing how they do things. I think in terms of local authorities that don't yet have maybe an identifiable protocol, so for some, the number of cases that they'll experience are so small that the work to establish a set protocol hasn't been brought forward yet. We may see that really, we're raising awareness with local authorities around the impact of the changes in EU rights, EA nationals' rights, because that may mean they have new families and individuals coming forward and they'll need to do something different, and their existing safeguarding protocols and policies may not feel sufficient. So we offer both advice through COSLA and the online guidance and routes into other local authorities. But we are taking some further steps, particularly on domestic abuse. We've already started to work with Women's Aid and the Scottish Government on, under the Ending Homelessness Together action plan, looking at how to improve housing outcomes for women and girls, women and children, experiencing abuse, and looking at actually, what's the kind of picture in terms of how the duties are applied and the recognition of abuse as a factor when NRPF conditions are placed on an individual. What are the referral pathways and what are the duties councils have? And so that piece of work will hopefully strengthen the kind of understanding within social work of practice and what might be possible under the powers that they hold. And the review that I mentioned that we're hoping to bring forward under the anti-destitution strategy of the powers local authorities have, that will bring us back to both the funding of the support itself, because that not having enough money is a real pressure for councils. Like there are really significant decisions being taken about public spending, and local government have very difficult decisions to make. This is an area of spend that is not factored into the settlement. There isn't a baseline for us to work from. It is a very real pressure. But actually, in addition to that, quantifying the staff time, the complexity, because you're not only doing social work, the social workers we speak to realise they have to also provide an understanding of the immigration system. They have to refer people for legal advice, help with evidencing residency and applying for change in NRPF conditions. There's all sorts of processes. And so understanding what the administrative capacity needs of local authorities are will be really a big part of that review. So I suppose in short, we're continuing within COSLA to try to prioritise the support for councils to have consistency in terms of outcomes and, if not process, and helping where we can. We're also looking at additional capacity. So we have a partnership with the UN's International Migration Agency. So we have 2 or 3 caseworkers routinely supporting local authorities at the moment, particularly around the EU settlement scheme, so raising awareness of how it works, but also providing additional casework support to vulnerable people within local authority care, so looked after children, adults with additional vulnerabilities, to try and ensure that they can access that scheme and overcome some of the barriers that they're facing. And we think that model is showing really good results. So we're hopeful that we might be able to, with some support from Scottish Government, expand that to also look more at NRPF and the wider range of immigration issues. And that really does resolve the length of time that people need to be within the local authority. I'm really sorry, if I could the point that I was wanting to make before was just a point of clarification as well around the public health duties. Would you mind if I just briefly responded to that? When we were discussing before what's been possible during the pandemic and what local authorities can do, and the kind of, the references to accommodation being provided, the legal basis changed because of COVID. So when COVID-19 became a notifiable disease under the public health legislation, that enabled local authorities to provide homelessness accommodation to everybody. As we start to see the lockdown restrictions ease and travel restrictions lift, that changes the use of that legislation. And that's why we're in a really tricky position. Whilst there's lots of opportunity, there will still be groups of people for whom local authority housing and homelessness services will not be accessible, and where they haven't got an eligible need under social work responsibilities. And the only source of support that they can seek is through the third sector, and understanding how the third sector, who don't often operate as another, I suppose, in terms of your protocol, the third sector partners do a fantastic job, but they're not always nationally available. And there are lots of local authority areas who won't have third sector partners with the knowledge of NRPF.
Okay. Eloise, we're going to have to move on.
Thank you.
Am I able to ask a quick follow-up,
Yeah,
Jerry? Thanks for your indulgence, convener. Jerry, can I just ask about the bit in your evidence where you talk about the definitions of women who experience domestic violence and abuse and the issue of perpetrators? You say that there's an issue there about some women fall through the loophole. Can you just say very briefly how the guidance needs to change so we can address that?
I'm so glad you asked that question. I was just thinking about it, whether to say it or not to say it. In the Scottish government, in Scottish definition of domestic abuse, when it comes to perpetrators, it doesn't include family members in that criteria. But when you talk about forced marriage or FGM, the perpetrators are family members. Sometimes there is no partner or ex-partner. FGM happens before you're married. Forced marriage happens before you're married. So what happened, the experience that we had, when these women, because they were at high risk and can't stay in Edinburgh, when they were referred to other agent organizations in other areas of Scotland, they weren't offered the refuge space because the perpetrator is not ex-partner or the partner. So, we are saying forced marriage and FGM and honor-based violence is domestic abuse, but at the same time, because the perpetrators are not partner or ex-partner, then the service is not available to them. So I think we need to acknowledge that, that in certain cultures with certain forms of domestic abuse, the perpetrator is not always your husband or ex-partner or partner. It's other family members. That's what, and because of that, they are missing out on service. And that's what.
Okay. Thank you very much for that. No, Deirdre, I'm going to have to move on. I'm sorry, we've covered a lot. We've still got a lot to cover. So I've got Keith coming in, but before I do, can I ask if we make our answers a bit shorter than we have to date, because we are taking up a lot of time and we've still got a lot to go through. Keith, thank you.
Thanks, Convener. I'll just ask the one question if I can, and just to say to the panel, it's been really useful to hear the occasional reference to the situation out with Edinburgh and Glasgow. I realise that's where the biggest scale of the issue is, but for those of us out with Edinburgh and Glasgow, it's an important issue as well. We've had back to do a fantastic event in Alloa about a year ago. My question was about the pandemic and how the response has been in terms of the pandemic. So, the Scottish Government, as has been mentioned, has repeatedly urged the UK Government to suspend the policy on NRPF, and COSLA has done the same as well during the COVID pandemic. And the Scottish Government's also provided £500,000 in grant funding specifically for NRPF support during the pandemic. Do you think, though, that the Scottish Government has done enough during the pandemic to support people with NRPF, or could it do more, and if so, what more should it be doing? If we can start off with Eloise, please.
I think the availability of additional funding has been absolutely crucial from the local authority point of view and was really welcomed. And certainly my understanding from councils is that the funding, whether to the council directly or the funding that was made available to the third sector, its presence enabled the provision of accommodation and food and other assistance that wouldn't have been possible otherwise. So that was really welcomed. I think where we've learnt, and it's not so much about doing more, but just learning and reflection, that we need a more strategic response to NRPF. So, we did collaborate with the Scottish Government when we formed the consortium, bringing third sector partners and the local authorities together to identify needs and target the support and the resources. And we need to do more of that. Often the way in which we're responding is very localised, and councils actually do have shared challenges there that we need to think about. If we're resourcing the third sector, how do we do that strategically so that they can be scaling up their provision into local authority areas outside of the central belt, as you mentioned, and we need to do that together and in closer conversation. I think there's other learning around policy areas beyond the Scottish Government's migration and asylum team. So increasingly we are seeing now an awareness of NRPF within Scottish Government policy making. So when we're thinking about new benefits and social security policy development, new developments in housing policy and homelessness services, having a conversation and a clear analysis of the impact on people of NRPF is really needed going forward. And something that started to happen during the pandemic. We were seeing that happening across Scottish Government.
Correct, yeah.
It's muted.
Oh.
That's you.
Partly not on my screen, but
No, you were.
If I can ask Jerry, just if I'm getting the pronunciation right for her view on that as well, just what more the Scottish Government could have been doing during the pandemic?
Is that me?
Yep.
Yeah. I think we welcome the additional funding, especially accommodation was really helpful. But and for the food and all, but I think that was short-lived. Whatever was given was only for 6 months or 3 months. But we would like to Scottish Government to continue to give that kind of support. And another thing, even we were in dilemma, and the women were in dilemma as well, who were experiencing domestic abuse and want to leave their homes, but they were aware that whatever support they're getting, the accommodation that they're getting, it's not guaranteed that they will get they'll get the accommodation post-COVID. So some women, although there was this facility, they still didn't take the opportunity because of the uncertainty. what will happen after. Because at that time, I think we thought COVID would go away in 3 months' time, but it didn't. And the fund was only, whatever funding we got, some of it was for 3 months and some of it was for 6 months. We can spend within 6 months and some only for 3 months, which was, again, it's good, very good, because we needed that at that time. Otherwise, I don't know what we would have done, but we would like to see that to continue.
And last of all, Suzanne.
Thank you. So I suppose, yeah, probably very similar to Eloise, the funding was really welcome. Maybe to put it in a bit of context, Glasgow City at the same time, and roughly in the last financial year, not quite finished, spent somewhere in the region of 400,000 on people with no recourse to public funds from our own funds, for those people who, without COVID, continue to meet those eligibility criteria that we set out in our policy document. So the funding was hugely welcome, and it did take out that tension, as I'd previously referenced. I would be really keen to see the Scottish Government step more strongly into the strategic space in relation to people with no recourse to public funds, and recognise the impact across Scotland. As you yourself have pointed out, that we have big pockets, but actually it's that kind of national strategic approach and the national strategic framework to allow us and local authorities to operate with some confidence, if that word makes sense. Not that we're unconfident here, but I think that stepping into the space quite clearly of no recourse to public funds and a kind of clear strategic commitment to support and provide a framework within which local authorities, COSLA and the third sector can continue to work together. And there is an ongoing cost. There is an ongoing cost to local authorities that goes beyond the cost that was picked up during COVID.
Just a quick follow-up on that. Do you think, though, that the legal constraints come back into play out with the COVID situation to the government to move into that space?
We've looked at that sort of every which way, to be honest, certainly from a local perspective here in Glasgow, including QC advice, to make sure that we were, I think I referenced it at the very beginning, to make sure that we optimised anything that we can do. It's hugely restrictive and also hugely counterintuitive when you get into the bowels of the immigration legislation about what you can and can't do within local government, and it runs counter almost to your purpose as a local government and as a public servant. So perhaps continue to push it, but actually, having been in and out the bowels of the immigration legislation, the restrictions which have continued to be added to over recent years by different governments make it really difficult space, I think, for the Scottish Government. And apologies if I overstepped the mark there, Convener.
Thanks very much, Convener.
Okay, thank you, Keith. Andy?
Thanks, Convener, and thank you all for your written evidence. It's very useful navigating through what is, as you've already indicated, a fairly complicated legal landscape. Eloise, I'd just like to ask you a question. You said in response to an earlier question that supporting people with no recourse to public funds is, quote, expensive to resource. On page 9 of your evidence, you have some figures from the NRPF Network's UK-wide data about the cost supporting people with no recourse to public funds. Is it your view that if we got rid of the policy, that overall it would be cheaper or more cost-effective to support the kind of people at the moment who you're trying to support?
So the costs that are cited by the NRPF network and that I referred to in the evidence are mostly subsistence costs of financial cash payments direct to families with children and adults with vulnerabilities. If the NRPF conditions weren't placed on those individuals, they'd be able to apply for universal credit and mainstream benefits. And therefore, the issues they're presenting with of destitution would disappear. They may still experience poverty in the way that many families and individuals do in the UK, but they'd be able to draw on the benefit system. So that should stabilise their housing position. They would also be able to access local authority housing allocations, so social housing, and they'd be able to access homelessness services if they were at risk of homelessness. The costs would rapidly disappear. Those are purely costs associated with responding to that policy.
No, I understand that. What I'm trying to ask, though, is in the broad terms of the cost to the public sector, would it be more cost effective overall?
Yeah. Sorry, yeah, and I believe it would. I think we haven't been. We couldn't. It would be in this if you take into account that every individual local authority is then additionally having to resource staff time to identify people's needs, to assess their immigration status, to put in place appropriate responses. Those are additional costs that you wouldn't have if someone was applying direct to the benefit system or through your mainstream housing and homelessness systems. So that would reduce the cost to the taxpayer from that perspective.
Thanks.
Apologies. You also have, the wider costs of destitution in terms of public health impacts. So, the cost of the health service of people's mental health being impacted by destitution, and all of the other kind of unintended consequences of that policy.
Yes, Susanna, do you have any observations on this? Because what I picked up from you was that it is navigating the complex landscape that is quite expensive and time-consuming, as opposed to having people able to access routine benefits that everybody else does. Do you have a perspective?
Yeah, my perspective is very similar to Eloise in terms of if that was routine, and I think Eloise makes a really important point at the end there about the impact on those individuals and on families of having to navigate their way through all of that system. Our experience would tell you that does significantly impact on levels of anxiety, mental health, distress. We see it particularly in children with families. So we try to move really quickly to support them because we've had very few instances where we would have a child welfare concern. But the experience of people with families with no recourse to public funds having to navigate their way around that really complex system, and all of us in the public sector and not being certain about their future, really impacts on family functioning. So I think there's a straightforward arithmetical reduction in cost if people were able to access the benefits and the housing system, and that you didn't have that added complexity. But I also believe that actually that impact on individuals and on families has a hidden cost to the system, that where that NRPF not to be in place, you would see much less of, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I mean, obviously, COSLA, you said, Eloise, and the Scottish Government have been making representations to the UK Government to bend their policy on this, which, as I understand, has been in place for some time, but it's not obligatory. It's not. They can, if they wish, suspend this condition. What are the main barriers to persuading the current UK Government to lift their policy in this regard?
I think that our understanding of the position is that and this is a policy that's existed across a number of governments as well. It's a long-standing policy, but it has got tougher under the current administration over recent years, in terms of some of the restrictions on EA nationals. But that their view is that they perceive people with no recourse to public funds as being individuals who've chosen to move to the UK and therefore should be self-sufficient in the eyes of the UK government. They shouldn't need to rely on government-funded benefits, and their solution to destitution is that the individuals can take up voluntary return. So there are funded schemes that would pay for someone to return to a country of origin. And our difficulty is persuading the UK government that people's lives are more complicated than that. There are very legitimate reasons why people may temporarily require assistance from the social security system, and that the individuals, who are working, for example, and contributing to the UK have a right to remain. So for local authorities, they will continue to need to provide support in times of crisis. So the UK government, I think, have a different view on the cause and effects of destitution to perhaps local government in Scotland. And until we can seek some political agreement on the impact of the policy, I'm not quite sure we'll be able to see a change.
Okay, that's very helpful. That's all from me, Convener. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Andy. Gordon, finally.
Thanks very much, Convener. I think it's probably only right that I declare an interest in this matter, as I have a relative who has leave to remain in the UK but has the status of no recourse to public funds, despite being in continuous employment since they arrived and paying income tax, etc. So I just thought I'd better put that on the record. So one of the things I'm keen to understand is how the councils and the third sector organisations reach out to the communities to give them the level of support that we've talked about this morning. And a submission, Suzanne, from Glasgow highlights the number of people that are in hotels or managed flats, but they also talks about around 70 people who are in precarious and are surviving homeless situations. So, you know, given that there could be language barriers, people are in lockdown, there might not be very high digital computer skills, how do you reach out to communities and individuals, especially during the pandemic, to give the level of support that we've talked about this morning? Suzanne, first, since it's your numbers are quoted.
Yeah, so there's, again, maybe going back to earlier questions about what unintended consequences of the pandemic in terms of being able to offer that accommodation brought a lot more people with no recourse to public funds into our view. So there is a positive absolutely in there. And I think, again, working with the third sector, over the last year, we've probably we've been in contact with a lot more people with no recourse to public funds than we might previously, because from a local authority perspective, how they come into our how they come in on our radar tends to be a presentation through either through the third sector directly to our offices in health and social care, through GPs, or indeed sometimes through police. The hidden population have always, there has always been a hidden population, and they have always been really problematic to reach out to. Some of the work that we've done through the Everyone Home Collective, so there's a collection of organisations led by the third sector again, which we are part of, that has tried to reach out during COVID, partly because, and hopefully I'll get my words right on this, I don't mean to take advantage, but to offer some security in relation to accommodation for people who might have been in a precarious situation, in order that we can bring them into our kind of collective radar, if you like, along with third sector, to see if we can work with them to stabilise some of that. So this year, I think we've done more than we had previously been able to, because we had an offer. So we had a reason to bring people onto our radar. In general terms, though, it's really tricky for us, certainly as local authority, to reach out to the hidden population, and I think partly because, again, there's all sorts of cultural and language barriers about the local authority being part of the Home Office, or people not understanding some of the differences between ourselves and the Home Office, and where we might where we are in terms of implementing immigration. So there's a lot of misunderstanding about local authorities and local authorities' role in that. So I think the short answer to your question is it's got better. It's best when it's third sector led, and when the third sector are identifying people within the cohort they're reaching out to, who then need us and local authority to step in. This year has allowed us to be in contact with a lot more people than we were previously, because we had an offer. But that remains a challenge, and we would remain concerned, and I know COSLA is about the number of people who are hidden in terms of the destitution and the impact of insecure immigration status.
Jerry, what's your experience of reaching out to people that are being missed in the communities?
It was really difficult for us, because what happened, we had women who were still living with the abusers, and we were giving outreach support to them, and it became so difficult for us to get in touch with these women, because the perpetrators were living 24/7 in the house, and there are some women who were living with extended family members as well. this is the additional barrier for BME women. It's not just the women, children, and husband living in one house. They were living with in-laws and other siblings, and it made it very difficult for us. But we did manage with a lot of stress. It was stressful for the worker as well as the service user. So that's one point. And the second point, when we received referrals, that also made it difficult because women had language barriers. And when we had to work with, for example, when we had to work with the police or social work or solicitors, they need interpreters. During the COVID period, there was shortage of interpreters as well. Even they weren't working face-to-face. They were working from home. So we kind of became everything, the interpreter, the key worker. And some of these meetings were taking much longer than they should have. An hour meeting would take 3 hours because the conversation would be 3 ways. The woman is in her own, wherever she's living, in her own home, and the police are in their police station, and we are in our own home. So we are the interpreter. So you're going like whatever the police say, go back to the women. Do you understand what I'm explaining? So there were difficulties with that as well. And it wasn't easy for us. It wasn't easy at all. Lot of stress, the workload has increased because of things that I mentioned just now. And normally for us, one thing I wanted to say before is when Eloise mentioned about numbers in some areas are very low, no recourse to public funds. It's low not because there are no people there with no recourse to public funds. It's because there is no surveys explicitly shown that we are here, we can support women or men with no recourse to public funds. That's what it is. And that's what our learning is, So, and the numbers that we are reporting now, I'm sure they're much, much lower than what they're in reality, no recourse to public funds. I just want to say one more thing. Last year, we had 102 women with no recourse to public funds. We supported, since January 2020 to December 2020, we had 102. That includes EEA's women as well.
Okay, thanks very much, Convener.
Okay, thank you very much. That takes us to the end of our questions. Can I thank everyone for their time today, and members of the panel can leave the meeting by pressing the red button. Thank you very much. We'll have a brief suspension while witnesses change over. Welcome back, and I'm pleased to welcome our second panel of witnesses. They are Robin Qureshi, Director Positive Robina Qureshi, my apologies, Director Positive Action and Housing, Jen Ang, Co-founder and Director Just Right Scotland, and Graham O'Neill, Policy Manager, Scottish Refugee Council. Can I thank you for being in attendance today, and thanks for your written evidence. We've again allocated around an hour for the session, and I would ask that you keep your responses as short as you can whilst getting your point across. Members will again ask the questions in a pre-arranged order with any supplementaries at the end if time allows. It would help broadcasting if members could indicate who on the panel their questions are addressed to, in order for everyone to allow broadcasting a second to operate their microphones. And we'll move on to the questions. And my first question is, will the causeless migrants' right and entitlements COVID-19 and its implementation from frontline staff? Can I ask what
Okay, everybody, I think James has gone off and my mic has gone on as Deputy Convener. I can see you, Keith Brown. Can you nod your head? Have I come on screen? Right, thank you. Oh, you're back, James. Okay, back to you.
Thanks very much for that. But I was here all the time, talking away like an idiot, and nobody could obviously see or hear me. So my apologies for that. We'll just start that again then. Okay, welcome back. And I'm pleased to welcome our second panel of witnesses. They are Robina Qureshi, Director of Positive Action and Housing, Jen Ang, Co-founder and Director, Just Right Scotland, and Graham O'Neill, Policy Manager, Scottish Refugee Council. Thank you for being in attendance today, and thanks for your written evidence. We've again allocated around an hour for the session. I would ask that we keep our answers as brief as possible whilst getting your point across, because we do have a lot to get through in this session. Members will again ask their questions in a pre-arranged order with any supplementaries at the end if time allows. It would help broadcasting if members could indicate who in the panel their questions are addressed to, in order, and if everyone could allow broadcasting a second to operate their microphones. And we'll now go on to questions. My question to the panel, and I think I'll start with Robina Qureshi on this one. The Scottish Women's Aid welcomed the causeless migrants' right and entitlement COVID-19 guidance, but said there was a lack of consistency in its implementation from frontline staff. What are your views on the framework guidance? Robina? Yeah.
Sorry, could you say that again? Sorry.
Okay, it was about the causeless migrants' right and entitlement COVID-19 guidance, but they said there was a lack of consistency in its implementation from the frontline staff. Could you give us what your views are on that framework guidance?
I would agree with that. I'd also say that in terms of support from, for example, social work, it's almost non-existent in terms of the work that we do. And I'm saying that as a charity that supports around 2,500 people from BME refugee and migrant families each year, primarily in Glasgow, and predominantly people who have no recourse to public funds, in some rare cases involving children or older people. Yes, but by and large, we're on our own. In terms of the work that we've done from April to December, we've had to change the way we work to reach those who are most vulnerable, so that we have distributed emergency payments which are projected to be over £130,000 by the end of March. This is almost 3 times as much as we normally distribute. So that gives you an extent. This is for crisis payments for people in crisis. So we have been intensively working on the ground throughout lockdown, and we've operated a a skeleton team. And at the time that we'd given you the evidence that we did in writing, we'd like to add more to it. But we were intensely working with hotel asylum seekers and those leaving hotels.
In terms of the evidence, Robina, you can just send that into the clerks and that'll be added to the other evidence you're sending. Okay. Can I ask Jen her viewers? Oh, she's popped off. Okay, Graham, can I bring you in on this one then?
And thanks, convener, and thanks to the committee for giving attention to this. I think that not least for the COVID recovery. I don't think we're going to be able to have COVID recovery if we don't do something serious about ameliorating or ideally the UK government suspending NRPF. But in answer to the question, I think that we think the guidance is good. We think it's been well drafted and it covers the kind of the key legislation, and it spoke very early on in the pandemic to the fact that we had a public health crisis of an unprecedented breadth and penetration into people's lives, a real shock to people in society, and because of that, we needed to have public health being the overarching policy framework. For us, just as an aside, in the immigration and asylum sector across the UK, that was so much needed because, frankly, we've been sitting under a hostile environment which operates through the no recourse to public funds regime, and at its worst literally crushes people and really leaves people in a horrendous situation. And often, as Robina said, it's the third sector that are there, and communities themselves that are there to support people. So the implementation point, I think we've got to just be really straightforward here, is that that there has been problems across local authorities in Scotland in relation to understanding of no recourse to public funds. That wouldn't be a surprise because it's such a complex bit of legislation. As we come into the pandemic, there was good guidance that had been drafted, and Jen can speak a lot more, for all local authorities, and training that was done to kind of basically equip social workers to understand NRPF and make sure that they meet their statutory safeguarding duties consistently. But as we come into the pandemic, then that guidance was overlaid by the COVID public health guidance, and that again was well written, but we're starting from a place where local authorities and social work teams and homelessness teams don't fully understand the issue, and the cost is that people do fall through the gaps, and we need to just say that there's a huge amount of work that needs to continue to be done now, because the pandemic's still with us, people are still destitution as we go forward in the COVID recovery, and we understand the Scottish anti-destitution strategy by COSLA and the Scottish Government will be published in about 2 weeks' time. It is absolutely essential. That's a cross-government priority because of some of the issues that I think is behind the question that you're asking, convener. I can't stress this enough, that we're not going to be able to have an effective COVID recovery if we leave communities behind. And NRPF's point is to isolate and exclude people from the big protections, social protections of homelessness and social security. So the strategy that, to their credit, the Scottish Government and COSLA are about to publish and implement, the new Scottish Government will have to make that a cross-government priority. They will have to resource that so that local authorities can effectively meet their statutory safeguarding duties under Children's Scotland Act and Social Work Scotland Act 68, and also that the third sector organisations like Robina's, ourselves and others can work together to provide that integrated package of support that people need on the ground.
Yep. Graham, I'm going to bring Jen in on this point.
Thanks.
So two things, I think, Jen, that you can start off by responding to the consistency across local authorities in terms of, say, the migrants' right entitlements guidance, for one thing, but also what role you've played, and I'll be asking the other two organisations, in terms of helping to draft the anti-destitution strategy.
Absolutely, thank you very much. So as you know, I'm co-founding director of Just Right Scotland. We're a legal charity and we're independently funded to help people in Scotland use the law to defend and extend people's rights. The COSLA guidance, which you referred to, was co-authored by myself and the NRPF network, and I also assisted with the drafting of the COVID-19 framework guidance that we've just been discussing. We're also members of third sector and statutory sector stakeholder groups that have been working on coordinating the response, so feeding into the strategy that you've been speaking about. My view, obviously, of the framework is conditioned or coloured by my contribution to the legal parts of it. I think it accurately reflects good practice as we understand it during this very challenging period. But it is only a framework for guidance, and because it is a framework and local authorities are, as Suzanne said in the first session, left to grapple with complex issues, and in some cases a lack of sort of unified leadership on how we want to tackle this in Scotland, there have been huge inconsistencies in practice across local authorities. Some of that has to do with resource, some of it has to do with experience. I've delivered training to most of the local authorities on this issue, and there is interest. But I agree with Graham, I just heard the last part of what he said. The right way forward, in light of how this body of people who are NRPF is large and will be growing, is for Scottish Government to coordinate a cross-government response and also to pursue a serious inquiry into what routes are possible within our devolved powers, mitigate the impact of what is a UK Westminster NRPF policy. There is no sense hiding from it. We've seen in all the compelling evidence that was given that the policy has an impact, and that our statutory authorities are failing in their duties, the duties under our own Scottish legislation towards the people who live here. So just to summarise, I would say Just Right Scotland, in our day-to-day, we are lawyers providing direct advice to people with NRPF. We work with women and children fleeing violence, survivors of trafficking, asylum-seeking children and young people, and we work with European citizens as well as people from other countries. We see every day that there are thousands and thousands of NRPF people in Scotland. I think Gordon MacDonald, MSP, pointed out that to be NRPF doesn't mean that you're destitute. So workers who are in jobs, students who are studying, they're all NRPF. But the difference is that this hostile environment policy means that if you fall on hard times and you are not required to leave, we can't help you in the same ways that we can help other people. And there is a direct inequality between the support we can provide to families with children who are British and the support we can provide to families with children who are not. So,
yes. Can I ask, the anti-destitution strategy that you said that you had, you participated in, are you confident that when that comes out in a couple of weeks, as Graham said, that it will be met with support and it'll be welcomed by the organisations that are doing all the work, like yourselves and Rabina's, etc.?
Yes, I think it's. I think that, as Suzanne said in the first session, we have learnt a lot, and we have only improved the coordination between COSLA, the local authorities, and the third sector. We've learnt by delivering trusting projects together. And I think a lot of those lessons have gone into this strategy. But the strategy says that there's a lot of work to be done, and we need funding, we need core government funding, and we need a broader perspective on what Scottish Government and local authorities can and should be doing. I'll be completely honest about that. I think it's possible, but it needs to be taken up, not just released and left, and I think there's a role for this committee as well in terms of scrutinising that.
Well, whoever's convener next term will have that pleasure, hopefully. Okay, I'm going to bring in Sarah. Thank you.
Thanks very much, convener. Can I actually follow on from the point that the convener just left on, which was about advice for our next committee? One of the issues that has been talked about is in the first panels, it was about finance, guidance, access to legal advice, but it was also this sense that they were behind the curve because we were in a pandemic and then everyone responded. Can I particularly ask about the issue of EU citizens and the right to remain for them? Given that that is definitely an upcoming issue, is there more work that you could all be doing now to promote access to advice and guidance to make sure that those people are able to sign the forms and actually get the support they need now? And maybe the first person I would ask is Jen Ang, in terms of that access to legal advice. Is there a public campaign that you think could be done to actually avoid people falling into that trap by not having filled in the right form? Over to you.
Yes, thank you very much. This is something that really concerns us because, as you said, during COVID, we lost quite a lot of ground, months and months, when the people who require assistance now are the people who need face-to-face support or a little extra support, and they were not able to obtain it. I think any public campaign would be good. I think additional financial support for targeted assistance, so not just public advice, but actually the hand-holding or the face-to-face needs to happen. And I would add, because we're very close to the deadline of June 2021, I think also something needs to be put in place now for actually for the rest of the year for those additional applications that don't get in.
Thank you. Can I ask a similar question to Rubina? In terms of your work, you've got the excellent submission, that issue about how you contact people during the pandemic. Can you just give us a sense of how you're managing to do that? Because it must be incredibly difficult not being able to see people easily on a one-to-one basis. How do people get in touch with you? And then how do you offer them that support during the pandemic?
First of all, we do see people face-to-face. We see them in a COVID secure office. We operate outside surgeries. Since the Park Inn tragedy, we were on the ground and before to get information directly from people because we knew that people were vulnerable while the other charities were not on the ground. We were working on the ground with our staff, our skeleton staff, who could come out, and also volunteers as well. So we gathered information straight away, and that meant gathering data from individuals so that we could contact them. I'm talking about people who are as vulnerable as people from the Vietnamese community who had nobody to speak. Maybe they didn't have a mobile phone, they couldn't talk to anybody, so effectively they were isolated. So in terms of contact, I mean, the numbers that we have in terms of support for people with no recourse to public funds and people seeking asylum has gone up. Drastically. We just completed our figures for April to December, so they're far higher than the entire year last year altogether, and that was face-to-face contact. We won't have people directly in the office simply because we have to be careful for the protection of everybody. We are operating our office, but we operate it as a COVID secure office, and we meet people outside the building. We call it outside surgeries, or we carry out deliveries of emergency crisis support. In terms of pre-settlement status, I think was a reference earlier, we are doing direct work with individuals, primarily using social media like Facebook groups and WhatsApp digital networks. Our volunteer network is around 280 people across Glasgow and outside Glasgow in different parts of the city, and that's the Humans of Glasgow network. They have been crucial to being able to provide the direct support that our casework teams needed to be put in place when somebody was highlighted to us as being highly vulnerable. So, for example, somebody who had just had cancer surgery, major cancer surgery, was moved by the Muirs Group the day after to Easter House, and that individual was left with no food, no mobile top-up data, no Wi-Fi, and no money. The card could not be activated because the mobile phone data did not work for him to activate it. People were being given random amounts of money, from maybe here's £18 cash to £20 there. There are a lot of people left without no money at all, and they've been still living for months and in some cases over a year without any money at all. People who are living in hotels and who are desperate to get out. So in my mind, in terms of the work that we've done face-to-face, we continue to do that work, albeit differently, and we do it in a different manner. And when at the height of lockdown, when we were all told to stay home and stay safe, the Home Office asylum contracted provider, Mears Group, took it upon themselves to take people out, take no recourse to public funds, people who happen to be human beings, who happen to be asylum seekers, took them out of their accommodation where they were settled. It was their home, whether it was there for 3 months, it was their home. They were taken out when everyone was told not to.
Questions, please.
Yeah, I'm trying to focus. Yeah.
Well, yeah, well.
Sorry, but they were removed from their homes and put into hotels. The point I'm trying to make here is this was a lockdown, a strict lockdown, and we would like to know, and we did write to the Scottish Government to ask why this matter was not investigated and penalised and punished, because we were all told to stay home and stay safe, and the empty hotels were emptied. And that's not the only point I want to discuss, but it's an important part of the work we did last year.
Thanks, that's very helpful. I mean, when you started off your first contribution, you talked about supporting 2,500 people. Was that just Glasgow alone? Because that's a really stark number of people facing destitution. And when I asked my connectivity question, I was thinking about social media, but of course, if you don't even have access to a phone or the internet, that communication with people that we all take for granted, even digitally, is just gone. So in terms of the short term, as we begin to come out the pandemic, presumably it's additional support that you could use as a charity. The top priorities for you would be supporting people moving forward. What would you say that top priority is just now for us to put in our report?
The top priority in terms of, sorry, Sarah, I didn't, in terms of
supporting people as we come out of the pandemic, where public health maybe goes down the list of reasons to actually support people. Presumably public health is still there, but people's capacity to survive is presumably going to be undermined unless we have some support going forward.
The support that we need to be able to give people is to be able to see people face to face, particularly to sort their paperwork. Very often people have paperwork that they don't understand what is relevant, so they can't just simply scan what's relevant to you, especially in an increasingly digital world where people are remote working. But what it means is that we need increasing the funding to be able to provide digital skills, digital technology. We need to be able to also automate our own systems, which by and large, predominantly we were good in that way, in that a lot of our systems were already online. However, we need more support to be able to encourage charities to do that so that we can operate using that model. But at the same time, we need to be able to address the fact that at the end of the day, remote working is not ideal for someone whose first language is not English. They don't know their rights, and they don't necessarily have the digital skills or technology to be able to get the assistance they need, and they don't even know what they're meant to ask for because they weren't told their rights in the first place.
Thank you, that's very helpful.
Okay, is that you, Sarah? Thank you. Alexander?
Thank you, Convener. If I can just check out a little bit more about the cooperation that's taking place, and you spoke today, some of you, about the sort of targeted approach that's required, and the difficulties that individuals face because they don't have that knowledge base and they have to use organisations like yourself to support. So can I ask about what key messages you want to try and ensure that is tackled by the Scottish Government and the UK Government as to what the priorities should be to ensure that people are being supported, because it's quite evident from the evidence you've given in your written submissions that there are people falling through the cracks, and that is a major issue for us going forward. So if I can maybe ask Jen and then Graham to follow on from that.
Thank you very much for that question. So the question is, what's a positive way of stopping people falling through the cracks, or what does the targeted support look like? Okay, so there are some really good examples in Scotland already of programmes that work within the legal framework, the complex legal framework that Suzanne spoke about, but which are successful and positive. So, for example, in terms of addressing child poverty, There are things like the baby box, or also approaches to providing free school meals and grants for children in schools. They are not linked to, or they're not prohibited by NRPF. They are about using our powers to alleviate child poverty. And it's targeted because we need to create these universal programs that are not restricted in order to meet our goals. Similarly, when you look at the social isolation support grant, which is something that's given to people who are isolating during COVID, when we realised that if you are NRPF, you might not be able to access that grant, but there is a really important public health issue that people who are working but NRPF do self-isolate and aren't penalised for it. We were able to make that available, again, within our powers, simply in terms of how that was funded. So when I say targeted, it's another way of saying our universal services should be universal, and that will fix the problem. But if we don't make that step to make sure that they are, we inadvertently or otherwise leave people out. I suppose that's how I would answer the question. I know we're short of time, so I'll hand over to Graham, and I'm sure he will say other things that I'm likely to agree with.
Thank you.
Thanks for the question, Alexander. Yeah, I think I would just echo Jen's point. The starting point in Scotland should be a universalist approach to social security, and then work back for that. Hopefully that will be able to bring in powers, because one of the problems with NRPF is because it operates at the structure of legislation and policy, the social security and the homelessness assistance policies that come after it have to reflect that structure, which is NRPF, restricting people's entitlement to those provisions. So we need to do it a different way in Scotland and actually have a universalist approach, so that we encourage, so that we actually make sure that we're not working within the parameters of the UK NRPF system. I think the things that need to be put in place, and I hope the committee can reflect and hopefully recommend this, is that the Scottish Anti-Destitution Strategy needs to have, first objective, relentless work with devolved governments and local authorities across the UK, who, for many of whom the penny has dropped about how NRPF is really fettering their ability to manage the pandemic in their local areas. And often these are the poorest areas of the country, the most areas with the greatest deprivation. There's a lot of alliances that can be built there and actually starting to be built now on the Home Office. So there's a political objective that needs to be there, because otherwise you're not going to get the COVID recovery that we need to get. So I suppose that's a kind of macro point. I suppose the second thing is getting maybe to Sarah and Alexander's question is about what do we need to put in place now. So I think what we need to put in place now is a proper funding mechanism for local authorities, ideally through the Scottish Government and the UK Government, so they can meet their statutory safeguarding duties. So that they can do it, because that at the end of the day are legal entitlements that children and families have, and also vulnerable adults have, regardless of NRPF conditions. The third thing gets to the third sector. The Everyone Home Collective is a really good collective that's been working a route map against destitution in Scotland. It comprises housing and refugee rights organisations. We're hoping that it will be in the Scottish Anti-Destitution Strategy. What it's really trying to get at is that in Scotland, the public and third sector work together and actually put the practical stuff in place that's needed. So for us, the key things that need to be in place, and the route map talks about this, is an integrated package of support that wraps around the person, and that comprises accommodation, essential financial support, access to advocacy, access to legal, and access to health. 5 kind of essential things that need to be there so that people are safe in accommodation. That's a pivotal intervention, and then they can actually have, through that safety, the kind of trusting relationships with people, their advocacy workers, and others, that they can then start to make, progress again in their lives, rather than being stuck in this kind of constant precarious existence that stems basically from the NRPF regime. And that needs to be funded strategically, over the 3 years of this strategy, because that's the way that we're going to keep people safe, and that's the way that we're going to get them to make an informed choice about their futures and hopefully regularise their status. The third thing is about lived experience. That we need to protect against this strategy, being detached from the actual people who experience destitution. I don't experience destitution, so there needs to be a whole range of people who experience this, who are supported over the 3 years of the strategy, to basically be holding this strategy to account and to be making sure that it's real and it's meaningful. Otherwise, it becomes unintentionally detached from reality. Darren McGarvey put this really well in his recent series in Social Class. You get an assumptions-based, well-intentioned assumptions-based policy. I don't think this is what a strategy is going to be, but it needs to build in right now 3-year funding for independent lived experience group to monitor the operation of the strategy. I think if we can get those 3 things in place, relentless political campaigning across the UK against NRPF, proper practical funding for what people actually need, those 5 things that I mentioned earlier, and then that lived experience group, then building upon what I said more fundamentally at the start, is this needs to be a cross-government priority. It cannot be a marginal issue, because otherwise that's wrong ethically, but it's actually going to further undermine the public health recovery that we all want to get from COVID. We need to make sure that strategy is properly a cross-government priority. Mental health, trafficking, exploitation, child poverty, social security, touching all these different aspects of the new government's policy.
Thank you, Convener. That's been a very comprehensive response. Thank you to my question.
Thank you very much. Gordon MacDonald, please.
Thanks very much, Convener. I was wanting to ask a question of Jen. In your evidence, this morning we've talked a lot about targeted support, either by third sector or public authorities. But in my experience, most people, especially asylum seekers, they just want to work to support their families. So I was wondering, you said in your evidence about the Lift the Ban campaign. I'm just wondering if you could highlight how that is going at the moment and what this committee could do to highlight the campaign to extend the rights to work to asylum seekers.
Absolutely. Thank you for that question, Gordon. So the Lift the Ban campaign is a campaign asking for asylum seekers to be given the right to work, as you said. It used to be the case many years in the past, at the start of my immigration practice, that asylum seekers were permitted to work or could ask for permission to continue to work. And it was a practical way to actually alleviate the cost of accommodating and supporting asylum seekers. If you are in employment, you can continue to work and pursue your asylum claim, and we don't require to support you through asylum support. That changed some years ago, and the change was part of taking asylum support out of mainstream benefit system and putting it into a separate system that is administered by the Home Office. And it won't surprise you to know that that change also has something to do with the increase in hostile environment provisions. So if you claim asylum because you fear to return home, we remove you from the right to work and also from mainstream benefits and keep you in this system with less financial provision and poorer housing, to be honest, intentionally to make asylum seeking less attractive. And that is what the policy of the government said in its guidance at the time it did it. The Lift the Ban campaign is both a sensible move in terms of asking for a better approach, a more economic approach, how we support asylum seekers. The Home Office said that seeking asylum should only take 6 months, but actually it can take years, and there's a difference between being in a reduced financial position for a short period of time and being there for years. It is also about dignity. For asylum seekers want to contribute to our community. Many of them have professional qualifications, are teachers, doctors, nurses, and so on, and yet they are restricted from being able to contribute that to our society whilst they're here and waiting for a decision that is not in their hands. So the Lift the Ban campaign has been gathering steam north and south. We fully support it, as do a number of the third sector organisations in Scotland and on this call. The issue is that just like NRPF, Lift the Ban and this provision is a reserved matter to the Home Office. But I guess what I would say is it changed before, so it can certainly change back. and support and pressure from the Scottish Government, from Scottish local authorities, and from the public would be very welcome. I think there's a real possibility that this could change, particularly as COVID has shifted everything about how we fund people's support and how we see people contributing to the NHS and our education system.
Okay, thanks very much for that. Graham, you maybe heard earlier on that I have a relative that, although they're in continuous employment, they have no recourse to public funds. And I noticed in your evidence that you're talking about that it's deeply hypocritical and unfair that people are paying tax and are not allowed to, on the odd occasion when they need that support from Social Security, that you've suggested it's unfair and creates risk to safety and well-being. Could you maybe expand on that, please?
Thank you, Gordon. And just, I suppose, just to follow on for Jen, firstly, we really support the Lift the Ban campaign, and that's partly because that's what people want more than anything else. When I speak to people that are seeking refugee protection, that's what they want. They want to be given that key socioeconomic right to contribute, to chart their own course in their new community in Glasgow or whatever it is in the UK. On that point I was making was I suppose that stems from a deeper kind of tactic that we, and a very effective tactic that the UK government through the Home Office consistently or persistently push, which is to shunt responsibility and costs onto devolved governments and local authorities across the UK. And the third sector and charities. And the NRPF says that is the way that this happens in social security policy. It absolutely happens in asylum dispersal policy, where asylum seekers are moved on a no-choice basis to private accommodation in the cheapest housing markets within the UK, in the areas with the deepest, most entrenched forms of multiple deprivation, and no direct funding by the Home Office is paid to either local authorities or the third sector. I mean, it's the Home Office that are scamming the rest of the UK, frankly, on dispersal, and it's the same with NRPF, and it's deeply insulting, and this is why we made these points in this submission that we put in, is that for people that have contributed, and then they are told when they need that, you're not getting it. I mean, those individuals have been treated in a really egregious manner, and actually it's the Home Office that are scamming the individuals. Individuals come and they contribute, they work, they pay taxes. How dare the Home Office come along through their no recourse to public funds system and say, we're not here now. We've benefited from all the work and effort you've put in, but we're not going to be here now. And actually, who has to then pay? The individual has to pay, and their families, through potentially destitution and being at risk of exploitation. The local authorities and the third sector have to step in to try and help. If they're there, they might not be there, to try and help. And the Home Office detached the officials and the politicians that run this system, frankly, for ideological reasons. I've yet to meet a Home Office official that shows me the written evidence, the written evaluation that actually tells the NRPF works in its own terms, in terms of, that people are coming for social security benefits. Of course, they're not doing that. People are coming to contribute, and there's no evidence of it. That's why I describe it not loosely, but factually as an ideological mechanism, NRPF. So basically what NRPF does is it shunts the costs and the responsibility onto to those that are least able to deal with it. The individual, the local authority, often deprived areas, and the charities and the communities within it. And that's why NRPF is obviously something that is, and I keep saying it, it's a structural thing. It is the thing that needs to be, particularly in this COVID recovery phase, dismantled, because it drags people down into its pretty dreadful tentacles and keeps them there, and you can't get free of it. And obviously the strategy will be important, because that's to try and pull people out of it and try and make sure that they're safe in accommodation, get good access to the services, health, legal accommodation that they need, so that they can then move on with their lives, hopefully make choices about their futures and ideally regularise their status. So the the issue that you described with your family member, I've dealt with a couple of cases as well, around individuals who have conditions in their leaves, because there's two groups within the NRPF population. There's the people who are very vulnerable predicament that have got no, they're undocumented and they're classed as irregular migrants. And then there's the group who have leave to remain, but they have conditions placed in that leave, just such as the family member you were referring to earlier. And the Home Office, you have to then go through the legal process to try and get those conditions lifted. I've been involved in some cases, where that's happened, and there's other people in the call that they do this much more than I or we do at SRC. And but that's all symptoms. That activity is all symptoms of the deeper problem, that people are been having these conditions placed on them for no good reason at all. And when, to add insult to the injury, when they actually, as more people are doing now, because of the COVID-induced EU withdrawal-induced recession that we're in, that's hitting certain sectors where there's a significant minority of migrant workers in, such as hospitality, as Eloise touched on earlier, and agriculture, people are going to start losing their jobs, are losing their jobs. And if they've not got a social security system or a homelessness system to fall back on, they're destitute. And who's sitting there? It's the Home Office officials and politicians sitting there operating over this system. So we need to just get really smart in this and get really coherent in our campaigning against what the root cause of this problem is. But in the meantime, practically ameliorate the effects of what this system does to people and local authorities and services and charities themselves.
Okay, thanks very much, Graham. Robina, do you have anything to add in relation to the two aspects I've asked about?
Just trying to remember the aspects. Just some thoughts though. As Graham's organisation said, yes, there was an anti-destitution strategy, and reference has been made to that and the third sector. And while we've given evidence to various parliamentary committees, and especially in light of Black Lives Matter, we're very concerned about the exclusion of black organisations like ours, that these discussions effectively take place in an institutionally white vacuum. You asked whether we contributed to the anti-destitution strategy. We commented, but we were never asked to contribute to the writing of it. And so these structural problems exist in Scotland, and they're not necessarily imported from Westminster, and we need to be conscious of that. And yes, we need core government funding, but we were not involved directly in the writing of strategy. And I would also agree with Jen's organisation. We want to see people allowed to work and be given recourse to public funds, so they don't have to rely on profiteering asylum landlords, contractors or charities, so that they have their own agency and can exercise housing choice and achieve financial autonomy. And we want to see the Scottish Government call for the thousands of asylum seekers living in Scotland to be allowed to work as well, so that they can contribute to the Scottish tax base and achieve financial autonomy. And while asylum is reserved, there's nothing to stop the Scottish Government campaigning more vigorously with the UK Government to make this happen. That's the only points I would add, I think.
Okay, thank you very much. That's me, convener.
Right. Thank you, Gordon. Andy?
Thanks very much, convener, and thank you to witnesses for their very valuable evidence. Can I start with Graham O'Neill? In your evidence, you talk about the NRPF regime as a form of UK state hostility to migrants, and you point out, of course, that this is a legal power, not a duty under the Immigration Act 1971. Have governments of all persuasions since 1971 been adopting this policy, or have there been variations over that period?
I mean, fellow witnesses might be better placed about, the kind of longer term, deployment of this power. But certainly, since 2012, it's been used, we think pretty relentlessly and extensively. And when the hostile environment became kind of like, kind of unashamed public policy from the then Home Secretary Theresa May, and then before then as well, also. And I think the no recourse to public funds system, and the asylum support system, they basically separate out people, human beings, people seeking asylum and people who are here through different other immigration routes as having very highly controlled and highly systematic kind of like prohibition of the kind of core socioeconomic rights to work, to have social security, to have access to housing of their own choosing, etc. So, the NRPF and asylum support systems kind of like coexist and share much of the same kind of like aspects and elements to them. And it's generally about denial of rights. So, it is, to answer your question, the NRPF system is extensively used. And as I touched on earlier, we've never seen evidence that shows that it's justified in its own terms. That's why we describe it as ideological. And we think the operation of it, as I mentioned also earlier, is to shunt responsibilities and costs. And I think that's what's happened in the pandemic has kind of like reconfirmed that to us. But I think it's maybe hopefully exposed it to a wider group of people, politicians and others across communities in the UK, about the NRPF is such a significant drag on individuals' ability to go on with their lives, but also, I keep going back to this COVID recovery because, I think it's such an important point, and in and of itself, it justifies why this needs to be, that NRPF issue needs to be a kind of key structural issue. So it has been routinely used. And I suppose the final thing I would say is that, this current Home Secretary and the Home Office are really weaponising even more, if that was possible, asylum as we move into, the rest of this year. We're expecting new legislation, this kind of so-called Sovereign Borders Bill, to come into the UK Parliament. We've already seen changes in the way that they accommodate, and a real shift towards institutional accommodation, hotel room isolation, barracks. 2,500 people in March in hotel rooms, which is 2,500 too many, but now it's up to 12,500 across the UK. And that's really, really grim in terms of, the effect that has in people's mental health. And we've shared some of that. We worked with many of the people who were affected by Park Inn alongside Glasgow Health and Social Care Partnership in the immediate aftermath of that. And, the levels of mental health, the levels of trauma, the levels of poverty, isolation were horrendous. And frankly, we don't think VEARS were equipped to deal with that. That was one of the things that was really instructive to us. And at the end of the day, these are commercial contractors delivering a crucial public service for people seeking safety and protection. And the more we move towards an institutional accommodation regime and away from people being in communities, the more mental health and worse that we're going to see. So just to mention, we've noticed we've got figures from April to November in 2020 across the UK, 25 people lost their lives in the asylum support system. Some of that may have been natural causes, but some of it may not have been, which includes, of course, 3 people that tragically lost their lives. But the Home Office don't have a policy around how to deal with these tragedies, and more to the point, how to prevent these issues. So I suppose there's a real problem in the asylum system as we move forward with this new legislation, the likelihood it's going to institute more institutional accommodation and the harm that will do to people, as well as, and this is the new law, actually changing the ability to be able to access the right to seek asylum itself. We saw the early indications of that with the widened scope for the Home Office to render claims inadmissible that was introduced from the start of this year. So basically, you register an asylum claim and you're put into an inadmissibility pool for around 6 months, is what the Home Office are currently saying. And that is actually threatening a break with the UK state's relationship with the Refugee Convention itself, to be able to claim asylum and have that claim heard. So I suppose I'm mentioning this in this session because this is a big issue going forward for the new government and the new Parliament to deal with.
I want to ask Jen a question as well. The NRPF conditions are placed on migrants' leave to remain. Is there a consistent policy sitting behind that, or do you, in your legal work, find that it's a bit ad hoc in some cases?
That's a good question, Andy, because the practice has shifted over time. So the power to place NRPF conditions on leave to remain has always existed. It's specified in legislation, but in practice, Home Office caseworkers, they work from a piece of policy guidance. They are required to make some individualised determinations, and in practice, about 5 years ago, in the last 4 or 5 years, this was consistently applied by default, really, rather than determinations being taken. As a result, it has been successfully challenged in some cases. Earlier this year, there was a woman who was NRPF with a British child, and a court in England found the application of NRPF to this family unlawful because of the unlawful impact on the British child, who couldn't access things that the child had access to. So again, the practice has shifted, and it can and should shift again, in part because the way it's being applied now is unlawful. But I would also say, wider than that, the issue is waiting for it to be found unlawful is too late. The work of the strategy, the work of the committee, all of us, and as a lawyer, I would rather stop a poor practice affecting thousands of people now by working proactively, rather than waiting to challenge again and again as the Home Office shifts the baseline in terms of what it does with these powers.
And do you think it's unlawful for it to be, for the Home Office staff, caseworkers, to be applying this by default, without, as you would imply, any actual detailed consideration of the individual case?
If they're required to say that in court, they would be challenged. The actual policy says that there needs to be an individualised determination, and of course, all policies of the Home Office are unlawful if they breach human rights. So they will say we'll apply the policy generally unless it breaches human rights. But that's the key. The key is that people in these circumstances are not able, nor is it efficient, for every person to be represented to dispute the application of the policy in relation to them. And again, the better approach for all of us is to shift the baseline back, but more importantly, to build the supports that we can in Scotland to respond to where the Home Office has taken its practice for now.
Okay, thank you, Convener.
Okay, thank you very much. And finally, Keith.
Thanks, Convener. Just the one question, although a little bit complex, I suppose. It's really about where the committee should go with the evidence that you've provided and what the most effective thing for the committee to do. I think we have to face the fact that the committee can only do so much. So if that's the case, what can it most effectively do? If the starting position for most of us is Andy's one, that NRPF is incompatible with an inclusive and socially just society, and we should be attacking it at its root. To what extent should the committee be looking at following that through, i.e. inviting the UK Home Office Minister, who I'm sure will refuse to come, Scottish Government Ministers, to push that point? And to what extent should we be looking instead at the mitigation for it? I also sit in the Social Security Committee, and I'm conscious the Scottish Government's asked to mitigate all sorts of stuff. We do the baby box, we do child poverty payments, we do bedroom tax mitigation, and there's lots of demand. So what is the most effective way the committee in future, we can't take this much further forward obviously as this committee because we finish very shortly, what's the most effective things that this committee can do to help out in this case? And first of all, to Jen.
So I welcome the suggestions. I think, first of all, the Scottish Government can and must continue to make representations towards the Home Office. I agree that they're met generally with silence, but it's a significant devolved authority and one that the other devolved authorities look to. The second thing, more importantly, I agree, the Scottish Government needs to use its devolved powers to its fullest, and as you outlined, there are some really good examples of how we do that. And again, by legislating and by creating policy in that way, way we set an example, not just in Scotland, saving people's lives, but across the UK in terms of what a positive response is in this area. The last thing, and I mentioned this earlier, and then I'll close, is supporting that cross-government response. The pieces are there, including in our New Scots Refugee Integration Strategy, but they need to be drawn together. And taking whatever role the committee can, whether it's leading an inquiry or having a kind of consistent piece around ensuring accountability in the next government, that this issue isn't lost, but actually that the resources that local authorities need are identified, resourced and built upon for our future Scotland, which is increasingly a migrant, in part by operation of Home Office policies and in part because we are a welcoming and inclusive country.
Thanks very much. And Rubina?
Yeah, I would agree, James, that we want to end the NRPF rule and that the Scottish Government should be making robust representations to the Home Office and make the argument and make it publicly as well so that it can be supported across civic society. Yes, we very much appreciate the mitigation measures that we're given in terms of immediate priorities funding to help people, but that is emergency. But yes, we need to also, it's not an either or, it's also take mitigation measures. We also want to see people allowed to work, as we've already said, so they don't have to rely on asylum contractors or charities. And we want to see the Scottish Government support publicly the call for the thousands of asylum seekers already resident here, particularly in Glasgow, to be allowed to work so that they can contribute to the tax base. And finally, we want to see people, we want to see an investigation by the Scottish Government because of the breach of lockdown rules by the shift of people from homes into hotels. This is not a reserved matter. This is something that the Scottish Government has power over. Thank you.
Thanks. Just before I come to Graham, I just wondered, Graham, if you could also say if you think there's maybe been a bit of a shift in the most effective political arguments, which is to say that in a post-Brexit environment with labour shortages and so on, the absolute stupidity of preventing people from working that are able to do so and can contribute might require a different kind of argument to be made, or do we just attack the immorality of the NRPF system?
Yeah, no, thanks, Keith. I agree with everything that both Jen and Rubina said, and there is something very wrong about what Mears did last March and April and the way they treated people and moved them in the first week of a lockdown when there was restrictions against non-essential travel, but the Home Office decided to do it anyway. It was disgraceful, and there needs to be redress. It can't just go away. But in terms of your question, Keith, I think at the heart this is an ethical and it's primarily an ethical argument, but it's also an economic argument because people we're close to work with people in the asylum process, very talented people, individuals, loads of experiences of their own, don't want to be categorised as asylum seekers, want to be seen as what they are, teachers and engineers, etc. And and people want to work, they want to contribute, they want to be part in their own terms of society. So, so that's both an ethical and an economic argument. People are really talented, they've got loads to bring, but actually it's the right thing to do as well. And then that goes across the board for people who are caught up with this NRPF system more broadly and have different forms of immigration leave or are undocumented. People want to contribute. And I suppose the wider economic argument is around, that will, ensure that people can be part of society, aren't at risk of being exploited by, unscrupulous individuals or, worse still, organised crime, because if they're pushed to the margins of society, being kind of like met there by people who want to do harm. But I think it's also about that there's a deep response, as I've said before, there's a deep problem here where the responsibility and the costs are being shifted to not only the Scottish Government and local authorities in Scotland, but also the Welsh Government and Welsh local authorities, and also in the north of England and Midlands. mayors and local authorities under those areas. And this is where part of the different argument is there needs to be a coherent, sustained political approach from those local authorities and the devolved governments to the Home Office, saying we cannot tolerate this NRPF system anymore because firstly it's ethically wrong, but secondly it's just too damaging and we can't afford to keep filling the gaps that this NRPF system leaves people to fall through. And the COVID pandemic, I think, has really exposed that. The Home Office did not at any point under sustained pressure agreed to suspend NRPF. It took a legal challenge to get to some parts of it. So the argument needs to be both ethical, but actually economic and public health. It needs to be those things together, but it's strengthened numbers from those areas that actually the devolved governments and the local authorities inside and outside of Scotland together to the Home Office, because there's nothing ever inevitable about NRPF. It shouldn't be something that's there, as we discussed, but actually it could be, you know, with the right amount of pressure. I think it could be significantly challenged, and now's the time to do it in the COVID recovery phase, because otherwise people, as I said in my opening remarks, people will be left behind.
I think Graham's frozen.
I think he was drawn to a close anyway.
Up to be finished anyway, Convener, thanks.
Okay, thanks very much, Keith. Can I, that completes our question and concludes this evidence session. Can I thank the panel and the earlier panel for all their help and describing some very key issues for us today and giving us some thought about what we have to do once this is done. And as always, I just remind the members of the panel they can leave by pressing the red telephone icon. I remind committee members that we remain in public for the next item. Thank you very much. Okay, agenda item 3 is the consideration of negative instrument 98 as listed on the agenda. I refer members to paper number 3, which contains further details. The instrument is laid under the negative procedure, which means that its provisions will come into force unless the Parliament agrees to a motion to annul it. No motions to annul have been laid. The Delegated Powers and Law Reform Committee considered the instrument on the 24th of February 21 and determined that it did not need to draw the attention of the Parliament to the instrument on any grounds within its remit. Does anyone have any comments on this instrument? Keith?
Just not on the practicalities, just to point out the absolute irony that the two areas in the UK, Northern Ireland and Scotland, that voted against Brexit are now to have a border post erected where previously there wasn't one. Just absolutely ridiculous. But just to make that point, Convener, that's all.
Okay, thank you very much. It's on the record. No one objects, therefore that is agreed. And that concludes the public part of the meeting, and we will resume the meeting in private on Microsoft Teams. Please accept the clerk's meeting request for the private discussion, which will be sent shortly. We'll have a 5-minute break. Thank you very much. You know how to leave the meeting. Right. See you soon.